Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all of the time. Puddles and I are here in Plymouth, Minnesota, in the lovely home of Manny Laureano.
Thank you.
Manny, it's so great to meet you.
Good to meet you after talking so much.
I know, we've been contacting back and forth, messaging for a couple, 3 years, trying to arrange this, and finally, bam, we got a date. So thank you so much for inviting us into your home.
My pleasure. I've really been looking forward to it.
Yeah, and 1977 to 1981, Seattle Symphony.
Correct.
And ever since 1981 to present day,
It's been a
principal
while.
trumpet, Minnesota Orchestra.
That's right.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wow.
It's been a good ride, and I just need to keep the gas to keep going. Keep burning a few more years.
There you go. And if you don't know the recording of the Alpine Symphony by Richard Strauss and the Minnesota Orchestra,
People
amazing.
like that. People like it. Yeah.
it's amazing. And then this recent Mahler cycle that you're
Yeah, that's an
Under-
exciting project.
Yeah, that's great. So congratulations. Studied with James
Smith, Jimmy Smith
Uh-huh.
of the York Philharmonic. Yes,
Yeah,
my
yeah.
first teacher.
and Mr. Vacchiano.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, at Juilliard School of Music.
Yeah, and then along the way you had some studies with Mr. Jacobs.
Yes. Very significant point in my life. Points, I should really say.
How did that come about? What led you to Mr. Jacobs in the first place?
Well, first of all, in my section at the Seattle Symphony was a gentleman named Jeff Cole. And Jeff had studied with Vincent Cichowicz. And he was the person who really got me listening to CSO recordings and got me kind of educated about that whole mystique that came in the Windy City. Because being a New Yorker and having gone to Juilliard, everything was about the New York Philharmonic.
Right.
And of course, I was exposed
Yeah.
to some of the stuff about CSO, but Jeff really, we would sit down and have these marathon listening sessions. And so I got to learn.
Wait a minute. Marathon listening sessions with speakers?
Yeah, oh yes, absolutely.
Really good sound system?
Really great sound system. I mean, you got two guys in their 20s just sitting and cranking old CSO recordings.
No iPhones at the ready.
Oh, my goodness,
no
no.
computer. You're
Good
just like
old-
focusing on the music.
Good old vinyl. That's what
All
a
right,
vinyl
okay.
and
Sorry to
a
interrupt.
preamp and a speaker. The old school. And he got me understanding a lot of what went on with him and Vince Cichowicz when he was studying with him, and then got me listening to Arnold Jacobs very critically. And I said, "Wow, what an amazing player!" I mean, I really never appreciated as much. And then, of course, by that time, I'm starting to hear what an amazing teacher he was, and I never really knew anything about him. So, in 1980, the winter of 1980, I said, I'm going to take a week and I'm going to go to Chicago and I'm going to take lessons with Mr. Herseth, Mr. Cichowicz, and Mr. Jacobs. And just kind of do a nothing but practice and take lessons, self-made seminar.
Yeah.
That's what I did for an entire week. Can you imagine something so wonderful? So I wound up taking 2 lessons with Bud, 2 with Vince, and then 1 with Arnold. And the ones with Mr. Herseth were like my lessons with Mr. Vacchiano. It was all about music.
Yeah.
All about music.
Yeah.
The ones with Vince were a little bit more about, okay, so what's your method? How exactly are you going to approach solving a certain problem or going at a certain technique? Now, when I went to Mr. Jacobs, I really didn't know what to expect. I just heard he was this complete genius about respiratory function in the human body and how it applied to playing a brass instrument. And he had me do some playing, and he watched me. And I will never forget that moment where he just grabbed my hand and as he led me to one of his machines and said, "Yeah, you're screwed up." And he brought me in, and he started getting me to think about some things and some visualizations with the various little machines with blowing in with the ball and all that stuff. But since I didn't discern that there was a problem per se, it went over my head, and I really didn't quite get it. I mean, I understood some of it, but none of it really stuck.
Mm-hmm.
Now, fast forward, I would guess somewhere around in the middle 80s. By this time, I'm in my 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And some things in my playing, I just was not liking it. The sound didn't have the purity in it. There were strange little double buzzes that were showing up.
Mm-hmm.
The high register was kind of inconsistent. Meanwhile, I'm holding down a job, and everybody's telling me how wonderful I sound, but you know how it is.
Yeah, sure.
You
really
see the flies on the cake. That
Yeah.
everybody else just sees the cake, but
Yeah.
you know there's something that's not right. And it all came to a head in a performance of Mahler Fifth over at Kennedy Center, and I was not happy with that performance. So I said, okay, enough. I am going to go see Arnold Jacobs, because now by this time I have spent time with Ron Hasselman, who was the third trumpet associate principal player, and he had done some work with Arnold Jacobs. He was a contemporary of Vince, so he didn't study with him. They basically kind of came up together in Chicago before Ron came to the Minneapolis Symphony. And I called the personnel manager and I called the conductor for the next week, and I said, look, I need to get away for a week. I need to go do some study. I need to figure some stuff out. And so there was a need. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the part that everybody who has ever called Arnold and said that they had a problem will relate to. I called him up and I explained what it was, and he says, yes, I know what it is. Fine, come in. Mm-hmm. The moment he said that, when I went back to practice, things in my playing got better almost immediately.
Yeah, hope.
Just because he just said, it's... And when I went to visit him, within 20 minutes into that hour lesson, everything that I was experiencing was gone. I was back to just being an intuitive, normal trumpet player, being able to do what I'd always been able to do.
Yeah, that's terrific. Manny, that story just resonates. It rings so true in terms of, he had information, he could see some tendencies in your playing, but at that point in time, you just didn't.
No.
You didn't think you needed that information,
and here's what I came to understand from that first lesson with him, is that when you are in your 20s and you're strong, and a lot of the things that you do, like breathing, is still close to the optimal way that you do it. And right around the time you reach those mid-30s, things start to change, and the first thing that changes is the breathing. And when you were in your early 20s, well, you're hauling in all kinds of air all day long. Right. And you're still with that old breathing pattern. You realize that 10 years or 10 or 15 years into your playing, that old breathing will not suffice. I have described it like the foot on the accelerator going up a hill. If you keep your foot in the same place, well, yes, you will continue up the hill, but you will slow down dramatically. Okay. You have to press the accelerator just to stay at 55.
Yeah.
Never mind go a little bit faster, as I tend to want to do. So this was an important point that he got to me. And so what the basic trouble with me was somewhere along the way, I had developed not only less breathing than I needed, but I developed a pattern of stiffness in the gut. Mm-hmm. And he got me to understand that support was not what so many of us think it is. Where, what do we see our early band directors do if our sound isn't big enough, or if we're sagging? They'll look at us and go, "You, support!" And they'll bang on their stomachs. Well, when you're 13, 14 years old, and you've got an authority figure banging on his own stomach. Well, what do? You tense up and
Right.
you do that. Well, when you're young and strong, fine, that you can get away with a certain amount of that. But then, after a while, your body is screaming, sorry, pal, you're not 19 anymore. You are now 35, 36. And you've got to change your breathing pattern. And this is what Arnold did. He had me understand that the breathing is like the bellows. And you've got to allow the body to contract. That to take the big breath, okay, but then stop here is just going to tax the embouchure.
Right.
And you're just going to be leaking out, or you're going to be pressing out and using all sorts of untoward methods
Right.
to get air out. And so this simple little bit of advice, I'm not kidding you, Mike, when I say that it literally took 20 minutes. Because, as he said on the phone, yeah, I've seen this before. Probably 100 times, because, as Dave Monette so often says, trumpet players are generally a very tight, play high on the pitch lot. And he's right. Sorry, people may get offended, but this is true. I have seen more trumpet players playing very tight needlessly. I'm talking about the middle register.
Right.
Not, up playing above high C, where, okay, there's a certain amount of that's just kind of necessary.
Mm-hmm.
But to be playing in that pattern in the middle register, well, what is it that Arnold used to say? You have to have the good notes teach the rest.
Yeah.
I mean, there were so many of these wonderful little concepts that he came up with. And I will tell you this, that the most remarkable and wonderful part of Arnold's teaching for me has been that he appealed to a part of my brain that is extremely logical and has helped me to develop my style of teaching. So, based on the things that I learned from him, but with my own little ideas to try and help things that I see. The biggest concept that I think students come away from with me, if they're with me for any length of time, is the concept of the end of the breath as being the beginning of the note. Mm-hmm. And I had students who would breathe with the following pattern, where there would be this gap. Now, in and of itself, a good player can make do with that, but students that are learning, oftentimes this is a hindrance, not necessarily help. In other words, great players will play well in spite of that particular habit, not necessarily because of it.
And that's something that he would say.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
There you go. I mean, it's concepts. Yeah. So I don't know if you remember the movie Magnificent Seven.
Sure.
So if you remember the scene where Yul Brynner is testing out the kid, and he's having him put his hands out and then clap before he's able to put the gun in, and the kid can't do it. So what I would have students do is say, okay, after I would explain this idea of just taking the breath in all the way till the beginning of the note, I would say, okay, I'm going to put my hands here, and if there's any gap between the end of the breath and the beginning of the note, I'm going to clap. And so your job is to be able to get the note out before I clap. And of course, this always leads to some very funny moments with the students where they realize how big this gap between the end of the note, the end of the breath, and the beginning of the note is. But it's a big eye-opener for them as well. So
that's a great technique.
Well, it's worked for a lot of these students. There have been several other little concepts, but Arnold not only helped my playing, he helped my thinking.
I remember Jacobs would often say, weakness is your friend, strength is your enemy, and you must permit the body to have shape change and these types of things, the bellows activity, and So it's all sounds very familiar, and it just helped you just like that, 20 minutes.
Because it's logical. It's biophysically correct. One thing that I do with my students is that I have them take a breath and exhale, okay? And then I will have them take a breath and cough, and they'll do that. Then I'll tell them, take a breath, hold your gut as tight as you can, and then cough. And they will hear, turn into, and they said, you see where the focus is? It's way up inside here in your throat. They said, well, the lips work the same way. The lips, all of a sudden, instead of being a vehicle for the breath to just vibrate, the lips start doing all the work.
Right.
So this whole idea of the lungs as bellows, just and going like that. I mean, you know, we use all of the tricks that we learned. I think all of us that studied with him have, well, for years, I used to have a tissue paper, just a tissue across the room, and I would tell students to move it with their breath, and it would be, I'd say about a good 10 feet away or so. Yep. And the predictable thing, they huff and puff and try and blow the house down, and then I would go like this, and the paper would flutter, and they'd go,
less is more.
Less is more, exactly. So, you know, all of these little things helped my ideas become more methodical as a teacher. You know, when I first worked with him, he asked me about my student load and all this, and he said, okay, I want you to cut way back, and at the very least, I want you to not teach on the days that you have to play. And I did that immediately. I found that I didn't cut back so much, because I've never taught more than 3 or 4 students a week anyway. I just, you know, I just didn't have the need, and because of the particular hours that I keep. But the big change was not having those students on those days of performance, and it just kind of helped keep my head in gear with what I was doing. Later on, as I became more confident with what I was doing as being the right path, then I would have, you know, students come in maybe earlier, you know, in the morning of a day of performance, and it's like he used to say, the reason he was able to do that was because he knew how to put on and take off different hats.
Different hats, yeah.
Right?
Hat of the investigator,
exactly.
The hat of the performer.
Right, exactly. So the other big concept that I try to pass on to my students is the idea of making the second time the first time. Now, all of us have had the experience of playing through a phrase, we clip a note, that note's out of tune, this one fuzzes out, whatever it is, and then we shake our heads and take a breath, think about that particular issue, and then we play through, and it's just fine. And I, at one point, did that enough, so I said, well, you know, this is sort of ridiculous. One of the things that Bud used to say, and that Arnold would echo, was the idea of being completely engaged in what you're doing at that moment, of the singing of the phrase concurrent to the playing. Yeah. The whole thing about making your instrument into a mirror. And I'll tell you, there is nothing more true about what we do than that. It is absolutely true that if you are distracted, if your brain is not on the sound of the notes, not just the notes, but the sound of the notes, and what you want it to sound like, it's just not going to be as good. And we all have that experience of the second time around, when we clip the note, then we say, oh gosh, it needed to sound like this. Well, it's not that hard. You know, I was thinking a little bit before you came over for the interview, and as I started to kind of assess my experience with Arnold, I think what I got from him was brass playing, it's just not that hard. all things being equal, if you have an embouchure that functions, if you have a respiratory system that functions, if you've got an ear, well, for goodness sake, use that ear. Use that ear, listen, hear the tones before. I cannot tell you the number of students that I have had where I have had to just short of get on my knees and beg them to sing in tune. When I ask them to sing something, they'll sing the rhythm and approximate notes, and I said, what are you, some 80-year-old guy who's half deaf singing Happy Birthday at his grandniece's? I mean, no, you're a musician. You are somebody who has studied music. You have pitch in your head. Use it. Start to be able, before you play pictures at an exhibition, hear that G. Before you play Leonore, ba, ba, da, ba, ba, whatever it is. I used to have a little exercise where I would do, where I would have an excerpt, about a series of 12 excerpts, and each one would start on the next note of the scale. Maybe I do the part of Zarathustra on C. Then I'd have then I'd have something else starting on D and D flat. And it's not, for anybody who's studied orchestral literature, it's not that difficult to create that.
Yeah.
So, it's just not that hard.
Yeah, I remember him talking about often that the instrument in the hands should just be a mirror image of the instrument in the mind. And I remember in my own case, when I would have a missed note, he would query me and find out what I was thinking at the point of that missed note. Was it because if it was maybe just a malfunction of the instrument, like the cork fell out of one of the water keys, or I was thinking a note and sufficiently strongly. Okay, well, you're a human, so welcome to the club.
I can tell you that the times where I miss something, it's because for whatever reason I misheard the note, or it might be the kind of lick where I'm sitting around for a while, and then it's a very bitonal kind of, or even more into some sort of polytonal area, and I'm having trouble picking out that particular note, especially if it's up a little bit higher, because you've got this key going around you, and suddenly you're playing something in some 20th century piece where the note you just kind of find. I mean, I envy these folks who have the absolute pitch, and they're able to do that. I mean, I have very good relative pitch, but I'm not somebody who has perfect pitch. I would exercise the perfect pitch, the whatever I just called it, the relative pitch. The relative pitch quite a bit, and I mean, just driving in the car and singing notes to myself, singing things. I mean, really, for me, it's as I said earlier, learning to hear notes was really tied into pieces of music. When I was first learning ear training, and we were learning about intervals, every interval had some sort of song that would go with it. When I was doing the ear training at first, I remember the teacher, Mr. Martinez, would play two notes at once. When I got to high school, they would do one note after the other, and I thought, this is easy, because this sounds even more, because I didn't have to split the notes into two and then sing whatever little song was in my head to do that. So this whole idea of just constantly singing. As co-music director of the Minnesota Youth Symphonies, this is what I am talking to my kids about all the time, is constantly singing. when we, sometimes I'll, if I have my horn with me because I'm going to a rehearsal right after, and they're not getting something, I'll go grab my horn and just cold play something for them, and I will try and play it in the most singing style that I can. Because I tell you, I will never forget the first few times that I heard Jimmy Smith play. Well, in fact, it was in my first lesson with him, and you have to understand, I picked up the trumpet in 7th grade, went all through 8th grade, and then in the beginning of 9th grade is when I started to study with him. So at that point, the only live trumpet I'd ever heard were other students. And my band director making horrible sounds because he was not a trumpet player. He was a woodwind player. And when Jimmy picked up that silver French Besson of his and played this crystalline, pure low G for me, I mean, I was supposed to play it also, and I just sort of sat there, just with my mouth open, my eyes round as saucers, because I'd never heard a trumpet played that spectacularly beautiful in my life. And yeah, and Jimmy, since most of the times that I would see him, he would have a show to play at Lincoln Center that night. He didn't play all that much. Neither did Mr. Vacchiano, And this is another thing now that I, as a teacher, have to consider, and I do a lot less playing, if I can get away with it, in my lessons now, because I feel like I need to test my powers as someone who explains things clearly to a student, to be able to communicate what they need to know without necessarily playing it on the horn. I mean, I do play with them. There are some times where I have duet lessons with them, and I want specifically for them to go. I mean, I used to, very early in my teaching career, when a student had a sound that was not so good, I'd pick up my horn and say, and play the same thing, and say, okay, tell me the difference in the two sounds. Have them describe and say, okay, now that you described it, imitate what I just did. And sometimes the success would be instant, and other times they really didn't connect. And depending on the age, the experience, you'd have to be very patient with. This was, that's another thing in my old age that I learned a lot is from two very important people in my life. One is a gentleman named Bill Harrison, and he was my chess coach, and Master Alan Horner, who is my martial arts instructor. Two of the most patient men I have ever met in my entire life, because I kind of went at the idea of studying things that I knew I was no good at, but that I really loved. I love chess and I love martial arts. And their patience with an older adult student was humbling. And I said, I'm learning something here, and I need to pay attention to that and think about it with the students. I'm still an ornery SOB on the podium over at the youth symphonies, but the kids know that my bark is much worse than my bite.
Fair enough. Manny, did Mr. Jacobs have you do any singing or buzzing on the mouthpiece, and you went back? Why'd you go back? Was it...
Well, okay. As far as singing and buzzing, that was very limited. He'd have me, and I don't think he ever really had me sing, but the buzzing on the mouthpiece was the singing that I would do, because he'd have me. He was the first person to have me understand that the mouthpiece was the instrument. So I loved playing on the mouthpiece and having it sound as close to a trumpet as I could. In fact, many of the clinics that I used to do would start out with me playing Maria on the mouthpiece. And my job was to try, over the amount of time that it took to play that, to get people to sort of mentally start to buy into that sound, to forget that it was a mouthpiece, but to hear the vocal quality of playing that. And they really did. I mean, I could sort of tell from the response that they really did. And I said, this is the instrument, and the trumpet is basically just a glorified amplifier. Then this is where you have to really treat it. These are your vocal cords. This is what you have to treat with some respect here, and always that when the mouthpiece, don't be afraid of vibrato. Mm-hmm. Don't. Okay, so a lot of my teaching has been trying to make students understand that the mouthpiece does not necessarily deserve some antiseptic quality to it. You know what I mean? That it's, yes, okay, it's a tool, but it's a tool with feelings.
Yeah, you can be just as expressive on the mouthpiece.
Exactly,
right?
exactly. And that, I thank Arnold for that, because while I may have known that kind of somewhere in the back of my head, he pulled it out and put it to the fore rather than in the background. And so I will always thank him for that, because this is the way that I approach playing the mouthpiece when I do, and try to pass that on to my students, get them to really sing on it, and not to be afraid of the vibrato. As long as they understand, okay, if you're playing a Haydn symphony or Beethoven symphony, the conductor is likely not going to want that. Every once in a while you put that in. It's amazing what sort of a spirit that will give. So anyway, this is what led me to go to see Arnold repeatedly, because it wasn't that I had any problems from to deal with, but I just wanted to go play for him, be in that kind of atmosphere, and just say, okay, let's see what else is there. So we had some wonderful lessons, but my favorite bits of contact with him was over the phone, because I had students, and I would have a student who had a particular problem, or somebody would ask me about something. I'd call him up and I'd say, I just dealt with this kid, and he's doing this or she's doing that. What do you think? He said, well, my experience, blah, 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 blah. He'd tell you what it was, and he'd give me some sort of a little strategy. And more often than not, it would work out, So that was a real pleasure for me. And then the most time that I got to spend with him was when he came to Minneapolis for a conference called Playing Less Hurt.
Yeah, I remember that.
And his lectures were just wonderful. I was at every single one of them. But the moment that I will never, ever forget was at the University of Minnesota. And a bass trombonist asked him a question. Had his instrument with him. Arnold picked up the bass trombonist's mouthpiece, put it in his horn, proceeded to play with the most, once again I'll use this word, crystalline, perfect sound on the bass trombone, and it was completely cold. He had been doing nothing but lecturing all day long, and I know because I'm the one who drove him all over town.
Yeah.
And I knew what he had been up to, and Gisela was with him at the time. And there was my mouth, slack jaw, buggy eyed, looking at him and listening, and in complete disbelief.
Yeah.
So, this whole thing of warming up, yes, okay, there are reasons that we have to warm up, but if we have to go ahead and play without warming up, we should be able to. I know that one of his favorite shows on TV was Star Trek.
Yep.
And it's also one of mine. The episode that I quote over and over to my students is the one with where they're at the OK Corral.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And Spock explains to them and said, well, I know that this is an illusion. Intellectually, you know it's an illusion, but you are always going to have that nagging little doubt in your mind. And that's what's going to ultimately kill you. And so he does the mind meld with them, and the Clancy boys shoot at them, and they don't die. And boy, I'll tell you, that's the one thing that I think that Jacobs tried to get us all to understand, is that we had to really buy into the idea of being in that moment and really believing what we're doing. In order to believe, you've got to have the equipment function. You've got to have a good ear. You've got to have an armature that you feed air into. You've got to take air and be able to use it in others. So, everything is a little bit of a process that, done properly, results in a nice sound and general health in the playing. But I think all of us were very happy to know that Arnold was a Trekkie.
Many people have indicated that at the house, and they were in the basement at South Normal having a lesson, and when it was time for Star Trek, then the lesson paused. And they'd go upstairs and join Mrs. Jacobs and sometimes Mrs. Jacobs' mother, and they would watch Star Trek.
Yep.
And then after Star Trek was over, they would go back down and resume the lesson.
Yeah.
I think since we're trading Star Trek stories, so that one of the things that I tell my students is the Kobayashi Maru incident.
Yes.
The unwinnable scenario.
Right.
And basically, all the cadets who had encountered that unwinnable scenario, they were just following the rules. They were not going for the results. And so what did Captain Kirk, Cadet Kirk, what did Cadet Kirk do? He cheated. He reprogrammed the computer, so he was going for the results.
Right.
He was not going for the rules.
Right.
And so that's what I tell my students often is go for the results. Don't play by the rules.
I think that's worthy advice.
Well, Manny, it's really, as I said earlier, great pleasure to finally meet you. I feel like I've known you for quite some time. For some reason, I don't know why. But Puddles, we had a long flight in from Portland last night, so he's been relaxing, And he groomed his feathers before he came over just because he knew he was going to come meet you. But he also wanted me to make sure and give you a little token of our appreciation. Genuine Tuba People TV water bottle.
I shall forever be hydrated.
It's we thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
And now back to you. P.S.
There's something that Arnold influenced me on, and it has to do with, as far as breaking the rules and all that. He introduced me to the concept of the double breath. And as an older brass player, I have found this to be incredibly useful. In fact, really, I would say 90% of the time, this is how I breathe the initial breath. And for example, let's say I'm going to play pictures at an exhibition. Conductor's walking out, they're applauding, and he turns around, and you can see he's getting ready to do it. I'm already going just gently, and I'm kind of timing it, not necessarily holding it, but just sort of taking a deep, normal breath. And then when he gives me the preparatory beat, that's when I'll breathe in time. I will complete that breath in time. The big mistake that a lot of students make is that they try to take that one breath in time.
Right.
No matter what the tempo is, whether it's a slow tempo or whether it's...
Right.
And then they wonder why they don't have enough. And I say, well, just kind of before you have to play, just start.
He did the same thing with me, actually. Yeah.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Bingo.
Just so it's. So you have the second breath in the style of the
exactly
of the upbeat.
And that's so one breath is just physics, and then the breath that completes is music.
Exactly. Exactly right. Yeah. And just to be clear here, What we're talking about is not where we go,
Right.
and then
Right.
it's
Right. No,
it's open. It's
yes,
open.
it's just.
Yeah, he would say, well, you've got a measure of rest there. Why aren't you using that to breathe?
Exactly.
Why are you waiting the last eighth note
Right.
to breathe?
Right.
And I'd say, because I'm dumb.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
All right. Absolutely.
PSS. So we were just talking on camera about the players' injury conference in Minneapolis that Mr. Jacobs spoke at, and we were just talking about his Mr. Jacobs' description of his teaching, and he said some things to you that were interesting about how his teaching changed.
Well, this is something that I had heard from him and also from people that studied with him. Again, Ron Hasselman, who was a Chicago boy and studied first with Ren Schilke, and then heard about what Arnold was doing. And both he and Arnold would say that those lessons back 50, 60 years ago were very technical in terms of the sort of information that he would give, really full of all sorts of skeletal, thoracic, abdominal, respiratory function. I mean, really almost like going to a doctor in a way. By the time I started studying with him in the middle 80s, his message had been distilled to simpler sorts of commands. And then that's what he would pass on. He would say, just issue the requests that you have as very simple statements. Don't get bound up in all of this physical craziness, which was so odd to hear him say that after all those years that I heard of, that the things were so technical. So it's a wonderful thing to know that somebody as talented as he could see that there was a need for change, or that it would just make things easier for students to be able to react to his saying. Because remember what I said at very first when I saw him in 1980.
Yeah.
A lot of it went over my head.
Right.
And I don't know that I might not have benefited from the kind of talk that he gave me 5-6 years later.
Right.
So anyway, I thank him in my memory many times for teaching the simplicity of what this can all be about.
Very good.